What had happened in Cuba clarified to many minds the meaning of various 19th century episodes. It was the most recent chapter in an already lengthy history that included the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, the filibuster actions of ambitious American mercenaries in Central America, and certain explicit intentions, like those of Henry Cabot Lodge Sr., to set the stars and stripes waving from the Rio Grande to Tierra del Fuego. After this collective change of consciousness, it was natural that the liberal admiration for United States democracy, though it never totally vanished, would cede the foreground to a fear of what the next blow of Teddy Roosevelt's big stick might precipitate in the Caribbean and Central America. Liberal circles began to agree in relation to the United States with their longtime conservative rivals. It was a sea change in the history of Latin American political ideas. A new Latin American nationalism began to take clear shape, and its contours were explicitly anti-American. Ariel would become its Bible, the work of a writer who never set foot in the United States, born in a small and turbulent but educated and prosperous country that felt itself to be, like its neighbor Argentina, the Europe of Latin America, the only possible bulwark against the arrogant power far to its north. Its imperial dream now vanished forever. Spain could take comfort in the fact that Latin America, almost after 100 years of cold relations, rushed to a reconciliation with the humiliated maternal fatherland. The two halves of the sphere of the Spanish language joined against the same adversary and the influence of its language. The extraordinary generation of 1898 shook Spanish culture awake from 2 centuries of intellectual somnolence. The defeat triggered an examination of consciousness that led these writers to renew the genius of the race, to rediscover their own country, to travel its roads, and reflect upon the past and destiny of Spain. In practical terms, the problem seemed evident. We do not have adequate access to technology, said this generation of 98. We are left out of that competition, but we do have our spirit. And that is from the great Enrique Krauze, whom we have dined with.
Yes.
In his book from 2011, Redeemers, in Spanish, Redentores. I'm Joshua Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
And welcome to the Hard Country podcast. My name is Melissa Ford. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I am here with Josh Treviño, the foundation's chief of intelligence and research. So thank you for being here, Josh. We just filmed an episode last week. But we had so much left to cover that here we are filming again.
Well, there's never any shortage of news from south of the border, is there?
Never, especially lately. So thank you for reading that monologue. We can go ahead and jump right in.
Well,
do you want to start by unpacking it?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I read it for a couple of reasons. One, because we've had to engage with this idea of the Iberosfera, the Iberosphere, this concept that there is sort of a common Atlantic-focused world that includes both Latin America and Spain and Portugal on the one hand. And you have been knee-deep in it for the past week because you've been in Miami for the inaugural Carvalho Dialogue. I apologize to our Brazilian and Portuguese-speaking listeners there. It's not a strong suit. There's kind of a soft LHO phoneme that I'm incompetent to pronounce, but we'll say the Carvalho Dialogue. You were there.
Yeah.
It was 3 days, 2.5 days of some of the leading liberty entrepreneurs, thinkers, and fighters from across not just the United States, but also Latin America and some friends from Spain. Tell us all about it. Who did you see? What did you do? And what started there?
Yeah, it was amazing. First of all, yes, I was in Miami. I really enjoyed being there, but it was just the first of many conferences. We haven't had anything like this before. But it was, like you said, it was named after this Brazilian philosopher, writer, educator. His name's Olavo de Carvalho. Mm-hmm. And he was, I think, the first to denounce the hegemony of leftist thought, right?
Or the Foro de Sao Paulo in particular.
Yeah, he was one of the first to recognize the threats of the Foro de Sao Paulo, which, for the listeners who don't know, is basically one of many big gatherings or conferences of left-wing authoritarian populist leaders, right? Mm-hmm. And so the conversation was about that, but it was a conservative get-together to look at it from a bit of a different perspective, because we've talked about this, how a lot of the U.S., especially the conservative movement in the U.S., has really overlooked Latin America for a very long time. And there's a lot of countries and people in Latin America right now that are suffering under their authoritarian left-wing leaders. And so it's an important conversation to have. Hopefully there will be a lot more like it. But there was people from all over. I mean, we had our friends from Mexico. We had people come from Spain. There was a lot of Brazilians, Colombians, a lot of Guatemalans.
Interesting.
And yeah, I don't want to, name all the people that were there because I don't know if they would want me to. But
Sure.
It was an amazing gathering. There were people that are involved in politics back in their home countries. There are people that have started organizations that are very passionately fighting for freedom in their home countries. And there were even some people that had been exiled from their countries for things that they were writing, for speaking the truth or for criticizing the government. So it was a really amazing get together. I hope that we can have a few more like it. I know we're thinking about the next one being right here at TPPF,
Right.
Which is very exciting. But I'm sad that you missed it. I think you would have loved to be there.
Yeah, no, I definitely would have loved to be there, but next time in Austin, right?
Next time in Austin.
Can you talk a little bit though about the context in which it took place? And by the way, the sponsors, the institutional sponsors,
Right.
are us, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and also the Heritage Foundation,
Right.
who've done so much good work. A lot of the people there for many years in this sphere. But why was there a decision that this conference was necessary now to bring these people together?
Yeah. So this has been going on for a long time. Like I said, I think it's been ignored, but I think it's getting worse than it's ever been.
Mm-hmm.
Latin America right now, there's, like I said, a lot of people that are suffering under these authoritarian regimes. And a lot of us here in the U.S. know about it. A lot of us have read about it. What a lot of people don't know is how it's being orchestrated and what kind of alliance it's being orchestrated by, which even I didn't know a lot about it, and I learned a lot about it this week. But, like countries like Venezuela and China and Iran and Russia, who have formed this kind of big authoritarian alliance where they're all working together to promote a very anti-American sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to basically take over Latin America. And they have been successful. I mean, recently, one of the things that we talked about is, recently Brazil. It was one of the last ones we had left. And so that's something that they've been trying to orchestrate for a really long time. And I think the conservative movement needs to take that back, because a lot of Latin America identifies with the Conservative Party. I mean, even where I come from, we have a very leftist socialist government, but people are still very conservative,
Sure.
at least in a large part. And so the threat about the Foro de Sao Paulo is something that a lot of people should know about. Not just that, but all of its forms. The more recent Foro de Puebla, where basically all these left-wing, they're very organized, Josh, and I think that that's something that's been missing on our side.
Yeah.
But where they gather and they talk about how they can get organized and share information and what tools they can take to ensure that they don't leave power. And so I think that was very interesting to talk about, and hopefully this just continues to grow, and we can have something similar to those forums, which I know there's a Foro Madrid.
There is.
Which is one thing that was born out of dissent for the Foro de Sao Paulo.
Yeah, it's a conservative alternative. One interesting thing about this particular book from Krauze is he talks about and kind of illuminates the existence of this kind of pan-Latin American community of, it's almost like this what did Erasmus have? The Republic of Letters back in the day. And so I say back in the day like it was the 1950s, 500 years ago. And so it exists, right? And one of the things, I'm not that familiar with the late Brazilian philosopher Carvalho. You look him up, and certainly like mainstream press doesn't like him. I guess he was perceived as like Bolsonaro's brain, but it seems like his one of his key insights, which seems to me inarguably correct, was the existence of this transnational kind of coordinating template and body that existed to turn these Latin American regimes over to the left and then retain power effectively and definitely within them. And so Venezuela was sort of the test case.
In any way they can.
In any way they can. Obviously, Havana has a big hand in it. You and I had conversations in Mexico City in which there was a friend of ours who walked us through sort of the Venezuelan template and how it was being repeated in Mexico now.
Oh, yeah.
Up to and including, we've talked about this a few times, so the importation of a lot of Cuban personnel into Mexico. And so
it was done in Bolivia, too.
Was it really? I did not know that.
Well, just with the
yeah.
president finding ways to not leave power.
Oh,
and that's
sure,
something
yes.
that's replicated in a lot of South America.
Right. Well, yeah, it's not a renowned regional strength and relinquishing power, except actually under dictatorial Mexico, where they did have the la dictadura perfecta, and they were able to rotate out every 6 years, but that's gone now.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. Was there any particular story that you'd heard from any of the participants at the Carvalho Dialogue that really struck you? Something you didn't know, something that was just incredibly to you vivid and new, and something you want to share?
I guess there's two things. One of them that I didn't know a lot about was the intelligence threats. How there's a lot of like military formations in a lot of these countries that are really pulling all of the strings.
Mm-hmm.
And not to go into a ton of detail on that, but I learned a lot about that side. And then just on the more emotional side, something that really struck me was talking to some of the Brazilians that were kicked out of Brazil, just because they were bloggers or they were journalists that maybe the things that they were saying and the things they were calling out the government for weren't super pretty. And so, one of them is now not even living with his family, and he's not able to take care of his family. And he talked a little bit about what that's like.
And he's
just
Brazilian.
Basically, he's Brazilian.
Under Lula. I wasn't aware that was underway.
Yeah, and so just hearing some stories of people that aren't able to go back to their own countries, or people that believed so much in what they stand for and believe in liberty. They believe in liberty that they have sacrificed everything. They've sacrificed their family life. And one quote, this is kind of cheesy, but it's very, very true. But one quote they were saying is, liberty is like oxygen, and you take it for granted when you have it. You never think that it's a problem, but the second that it's taken away, it becomes everything to try to get it back.
Right.
And so it was just very inspirational meeting a lot of people that are just doing amazing work in their countries. So
that's fantastic.
It was definitely amazing to get to go.
Well, in the next,
we missed you though.
I missed you all, but hopefully next time I'll come. I will come to the next one because it's going to be right here in Austin on September 27th.
Yeah.
So for those of you watching on the podcast, September 27th, we're going to have a U.S.-Mexico policy conference here at the foundation.
Yeah.
There will probably be some other branding attached to it, which is TBD.
Yeah.
So we'll be announcing speakers and keynotes on that.
We'll start working on it
soon.
soon.
Fairly soon.
Yeah.
But any final thoughts on that before we go on to the next thing?
Not really. I think we can ease in. I wanted to ask you now about something since we're on the topic of Latin America. But while I was at the conference, you were also doing a lot of work. And this is actually something that you've been working on for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to ask you about your efforts on defunding the Smithsonian Latino Museum. I think the hearing just happened yesterday, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, it did.
So can you tell us a little bit about that and why it was a problem to begin with?
The Smithsonian, so to kind of rewind back in time, I think it was in 2020. I don't recall exactly when the appropriation was made, but sometime in the recent past, there was an appropriation made to build I think it's the National Museum of the American Latino on the National Mall under the aegis of the Smithsonian. Set aside whether the National Mall needs another museum, whether it needs to be in D.C., whatever. I do think there is a real question that needs to be raised as to kind of this increasing desire on the part of kind of the American overclass to view the United States as sort of this balkanized patchwork, and this group's got to get their thing, and this group's got to get their thing, and and it's especially it gets especially preposterous with Hispanics, Latinos. I don't use the word Latino, but because you and I are Latino, or somebody of African descent can be Latino, and so it's kind of a broad brush. But in any case, it was made, and what has since emerged in the past several years. And by the way, I want to credit the man who's been a warrior on this topic, which is actually not me, but it's been our friend Mike Gonzalez at the Heritage Foundation, who has done amazing work exposing what this Latino museum has been up to. And you can see kind of the preview exhibit right now at the National Museum of American History, also on the Mall in Washington, D.C. And it's I believe it's the Molina Family Gallery. You can go in, and it's basically their in-place exhibit pending the construction of the full museum, which now may not actually happen after yesterday's vote. It is a profoundly offensive work. I don't know any other way to put it. If you wanted to insult the majority of Americans of Hispanic descent, whether Spanish, European, indigenous, or anything like that, you would probably put together a left-wing, strange progressive exhibit like what they have on the Smithsonian right now. It is an exhibit that effectively argues that we, you, me, our fathers, everyone else, your mother in your case, I'm sorry, but we're the losers of history.
We're the victims.
We're the victims.
Right?
We're the ones who got stepped on, and there's a way to address historical injustice, which especially in Texas there was plenty of it,
right.
And to do it squarely without degrading an entire class of individuals, this historical cohort, into this passive and almost servile recipient of injustice and blows, because that's contrary to reality. It's contrary to, certainly I'll speak from a Mexican-American perspective, that's not who the Mexicans were. It's not who the settlers of Nuevo Santander, Nuevo León, the original settlers of Texas, the Canary Islanders who came to San Antonio, any of that. That's not who they were. And so to reduce them to that, which is absolutely what this museum does, is essentially to make a case for the existence of another historically oppressed class in the United States. And so ignoring the fact that throughout history, even at the nadir of treatment of Mexican Americans in particular in Texas, this was nevertheless a place where in aggregate people came to rather than fled from. There's always this revealed preference. You would never know it in the exhibits that they have at this burgeoning Latino museum.
Yeah.
I'll add one thing to it too that really exposes the politics. The use of language and rhetoric at the Latino Museum. They use the phrase Latino. For those of you who aren't familiar with this particular conversation that's been underway for 50 years at this point.
A long time, yeah.
A long time, but it's a modern manufactured conversation. I want to be really clear. If you rewind to say about 1965, it was very clear what you called people of Mexican descent: Mexican Americans, Dominican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, or Puerto Ricans, period, and so on. And so there was always this national origin consciousness. Not that there wasn't a recognized similarity. Of course, the intellectual class had this idea that there was kind of this pan-regional identity, but at the same time, there was also an understanding that it was profoundly different among people. Come the modern era of identity politics, late 1960s, going into the 1970s, there is this idea that everybody is Hispanic, which sort of makes sense. Then there's an effort to brand people as Chicanos, which is ridiculous. There is no such thing as a Chicano. I just want to be really clear about it. There's some left intellectual in San Antonio right now who's setting fire to our podcast, I'm sure. And then the Los Angeles Times, in particular, with its its style guide in the 1970s, actually started to promulgate the idea that we're all Latinos. Latino this, Latino that. The irony of that is that the kind of the demonym Latino originated in French political thought, sort of as an excuse for France to conquer Mexico in the 1860s. So there's layers upon layers of kind of ignorance and irony attached to this. But they've decided that Latino is it, even though, you look at like Pew Hispanic polling, and it's a minority. It's sub 20% of people who call themselves Latino on any given day. There's many more who identify as Hispanic. There's even more who identify themselves according to national origin. And so that's something that's very, very telling. Anybody who says that they're Latino, I know that one of two things is almost probably true about them. They're either progressive leftists or they're from California.
Latinx.
Well, so then the museum does this too. It ignores, because Spanish actually does have a system. Spanish language, a great language, majesty, dignity, everything you could ask, has a system. It's a gendered language. English is too, to a lesser extent, but Spanish, like all Romance languages, is very gendered.
Very.
And then when you want to use the gender neutral, it's os, it's os, and so
you almost can't.
You almost can't, right?
Yeah.
It's Tejanos.
Even objects are gendered.
Exactamente.
In Spanish, yeah.
Exactamente, yeah. So there's no way you can get around it.
Yeah.
So the museum does not go as far as some of these folks, which is replacing the O and A with an E, and so amigues, things like that, which sounds better, or with an X, which is even more. Nobody knows how to say that. But what it does do is, in its presentation, it will for plurals, for for both sexes, which there's only two, for both sexes, they've actually got displays that say many Tejanas y Tejanos, or they'll say Latina /O. And it's stuff like that, which is, and we have to be clear, is rooted in English-speaking Anglo-progressivism that has no organic roots in Hispanic culture, certainly not Mexican-American culture, that this museum is attempting to overlay on Latino, Hispanic, whatever Mexican American identity in the United States. So our friend Mike Gonzalez at Heritage has been a warrior on this. I was very privileged to collaborate with him and Alfonso Aguilar months and months ago on a column that went in The Hill on it. We'll put it in links here so people can read it. The great news is that a congressman whom in candor, he's from Florida, so I don't pay that much attention to non-Texas congressmen, but I got to tell you, Mario Diaz-Balart from South Florida is a warrior, and he read, it was interesting, he read the column, and his initial thought, as relayed to me, was that the column was exaggerating. So he went and looked at the exhibit himself, museum. And his feedback to us was that it was even worse than we said.
Wow.
And so yesterday in House Appropriations, he led the fight along with other Hispanic Republicans and the Republican majority to defund the National Museum of the American Latino.
Okay.
And so I don't think it's the last word. Nothing's ever the last word in Washington, D.C. But that fight was won. It is a well-deserved fate, and my hope, although I'm obviously all for the recognition of the contributions of Mexican Americans, Bolivian Americans, anybody else to American history, part of the story, right? At the same time, it's better to zero out the funds, which they did, than to have it done in a way that is damaging to who we were, who our forefathers were, and to the American future and candor. So I'm thrilled that it happened, and
That's awesome.
It's an example of bringing cultural power to bear to affect real politics.
That's amazing. Congratulations. So in essence, it was part of a museum. It was a preview, essentially.
Correct.
And they were going to create a bigger museum.
It was going to be a whole new museum on the Mall.
Defunded for now. Is there a point where we'll know more, or?
Well, I mean, obviously there's going to be a budget, and so
right.
See if it's in there. It's the unfortunate reality in Washington D.C. that nothing's ever totally dead, but this is getting to pretty dead.
Yeah.
So
we'll update our listeners if anything changes. Yeah.
You know what? Let our achievements be the country that we make.
Amen.
So, yes.
Well, all right. Thank you, Josh. I didn't know much about that. That's very fascinating. So thank you for sharing. I think if you're okay with it, we'll shift to Mexico and talk a little bit about the border, because there's a lot to cover on that too. But as you know, even when I was in Florida, the Texas border right now is like all over the news. There's all these articles being written about the buoys,
these
floating
system,
buoys on the Rio Grande.
Yeah. And
everybody's talking about it, and AMLO has been saying a lot about it lately. Actually, just this morning, he mentioned it in his mañanera. And somebody asked him about this claim. I don't know where the claim is coming from, but somebody said that the border agents have been instructed to, have you seen this, to push little kids and babies into the Rio Grande?
Push them into the water, deny them water if they're starving in the desert. Yeah. I do know where it comes from, but please go ahead. I can shed some light on this.
This cannot be true, but he was asked about it, and he said that first part, that first part cannot be true about the babies. But then he said the second part might be true, because we all know that migrants have a history of being hunted and pursued and discriminated against. And so then he said, which he just did this earlier this week, but then he began attacking again conservatives. He attacked our Governor Abbott, saying that this is something that conservatives are doing basically as like propaganda or a photo opportunity so that they can get people that are anti-Mexican and anti-immigrant to vote for them.
Right.
So he essentially said that. And he was also asked like earlier this week, what is Mexico going to do about these policies and about the buoys on the Texas border? And he cited a few passages from the Bible about how we should welcome immigrants and welcome foreigners. And then he also said, this was very interesting to me. Again, he said, don't vote for people like Governor Abbott, don't vote for Republicans. And then the last part is he appeared to mock any border security effort. I don't know if you saw this.
I did not see that part, no.
But he said, whether it's because the area where there's buoys is somewhat small.
Eagle Pass.
Yeah, it's just Eagle Pass.
Yeah.
And so he said, whether it's 300 meters or 2 kilometers or 5 kilometers, maybe, they really need to hurry because there are 3,180 kilometers to cover. And Texas alone is how much? It must have around 1,000 kilometers, if not more. So when will the governor finish up putting buoys in the whole Rio Grande? And what will he do with the areas where there is no river?
Right.
So I just wanted to ask you what you thought about that.
Well, first of all, there really is no area where there is no river. I think there's a cut right at the bare edge on the western tip of Texas, outside of El Paso. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Look, I guess we have to explain some of the context for it. So this buoy system has gone up. It's designed to deter people in the water. It's on the Texas side of the river.
From crossing to begin with, right?
From crossing to begin with. There have been reports that there have been actual dangerous obstacles. I guess concertina wire in particular, which is nasty stuff. We had I've worked with that before, and it's. Are you familiar with it? It's just kind of a coiled wire, and so it's always under tension, and I prefer to avoid it if at all possible. But it's out there. So we have to separate out, what we can verify is happening versus what's been alleged to happen. Essentially, about 48 hours ago, the Houston Chronicle, which is sort of the source of all this reporting on it, published a story saying, and they didn't name who it was, and we didn't get to see the source documents or anything like that, but apparently there was a DPS trooper, this Department of Public Safety here in Texas, who sent an email discussing how they'd been ordered to deny aid to migrants who were in distress, and so apparently they let somebody not die of thirst, but suffer from thirst in the desert. So deny aid, deny medical aid, push people in the river, and things like that. Now the on-the-record response is none of that's policy. And so to me, I mean, you have to separate out, what's actually happening, which in humility we should say we don't know. There's a lot of good policy out there that's executed poorly. Anybody who's been in a law enforcement situation, a military situation, anything that's high pressure and high stress knows that this is to be the case. So there's really no question in my mind that it is absolutely not the policy of the state of Texas to deny water to people in the desert. It is 100% not the policy to push people into the river, to throw babies in the river and things like that, which is what a lot of the national press has been living on to. In candor, I don't believe it. Now, do I believe that some of the migrants may have injured themselves on some of these barriers? It's entirely possible. When I say migrants, let's be clear who we're talking about. We're talking about trafficked individuals, people who have been pushed across. And so some of the folks, the New York Times had a story on it today in which they quoted a woman saying, well, they told us to go back, but we can't go back. Well, why can't you go back? This is what the New York Times reported and dive into. Why can't you go back? You came here, why can't you go back across the river? The reason is because there's a trafficking cartel on the other side. And if they go back, then they are unable, in many, many cases, maybe in a majority of cases, to earn the money in the United States the cartel is counting on for them to pay their debts for the trafficking that they racked up. And so that's why they can't go back, because there is a criminal cartel on the other side. And in a case like that, when you have that kind of scenario where it is large-scale trafficking of people who are being forced to cross, no matter what the barriers are, then you have to ask yourself, what is the most humane thing to do for these migrants? It actually is not to let them across. It's to shut down the traffic. That's the most humane thing. If you shut down the traffic, then these individuals, they don't get trapped into debt slavery. They don't get pushed across, threatened, or trafficked in the way that they are. They don't get sexually assaulted and so on. All the things that we know happen to these folks. So my hope is that the press, obviously, press is going to go after the state of Texas. Department of Justice is already talking about going after Texas for it. The nice lady who was the White House spokesperson, got out her thesaurus and said, many unkind things about the state of Texas and what the country means and so on and so forth. And so that is all happening. But my hope and expectation, and I think this actually will happen, is that Governor Abbott here in Texas will stay the course. And I hope he follows AMLO's advice in one thing, and that he expands the system to make it difficult to cross the river almost everywhere.
Yeah, I hope so. That's something that Mark Morgan does a really good job, I think, of expressing. He said this before. He actually just said it this week. But he talks about how the most humane thing that you could do if you care about migrants is close the border, because that is what's pushing all of these people. It's giving people hope that they're going to come to the U.S. And really what you're doing is you're pushing them into the grasp of the cartels.
That's right.
Where they're dying, they are being abused, they're being raped. It's terrible what's happening. And so if you actually care about migrants, you should care about what they're going through to come here. And they're being trafficked.
That's right.
What's happening is terrible. So,
and the trafficking doesn't stop when they cross the river. I think that that's kind of one concept that seems to be held by a lot of our friends, kind of on the center left, is that they make it to the United States, and then what happens? So next step, there's question marks at step 2, and then step 3 is that they're productive American citizens. if they are citizens. That's it. But what gets missed is that once you get to the U.S., and it's very common. I've talked to individuals who have literally just come out of the river, Del Rio, about maybe 18 months ago. And it was a group of Venezuelans, including one third country national who wouldn't say where he's from.
Yeah.
But they all knew exactly where they were going. They had places to go, and some were going to Portland, Oregon, and some were going to Dallas. But they had roles lined up, and the reason that they did was because the trafficking network actually is end to end, and so they would end up working at the places that they were slotted to work, so they could pay the debt. I'll put debt in quotes that they'd accumulated to the cartel. And so that network goes all the way through, and we have to think about when we stop trafficking at the border, we're not stopping it at an end point. We're stopping it at a midpoint.
Yeah.
And that to me is such a crucial point to make.
Yeah, and the cartels will never not collect their debt, ever.
Oh, or make an example of those who cannot pay.
Yeah, 100%. But it's just always a very interesting dynamic when we see this. Like, even another thing that AMLO said this week is he was talking about his beef right now on immigration is just with Republicans. But he was thanking states like the state of California, and he was thanking President Biden because he was saying there was a point where migrants were persecuted and where migrants weren't treated well, but thank you to the work. He actually also named President Trump, but he said thank you to President Trump and President Biden and states that have welcomed them like California. That's not really happening anymore. But again, not recognizing the blame for cartels and the terrible things that migrants are going through. Of course, he would never do that.
There's sort of this quasi-religious, almost like civic cult of the migrant, and it's always existed in Mexico, but it really has gotten amped up under AMLO. I think we might have talked about this in one of the other podcasts. When you go to the Mexico City airport, they've got these giant electronic billboards out there at the gates. Did we talk about that already?
We did. It was an earlier podcast, though.
Yeah. No estás en México, pero México está en tu corazón. So Mexico's still in your heart, and you're still in ours, even when you're gone. And it's a very strange. It's especially weird to see it boarding a flight to Austin, Texas. Which is not one of the major epicenters, but it's there, and AMLO is 100% captive to it.
Yeah, and since we're on that topic, I wanted to ask you about an article that I sent you a couple of days ago. It's an op-ed, and we were just talking about it, and I thought it would be interesting for us to unpack it for our followers. But it's basically about how any proposal for the U.S. to use military force against the criminal networks in Mexico is very irresponsible, damaging to our relationships with them, and it would be a failure to learn from the past, such as Operation Condor.
Yes.
And
Operation Condor? Did you say that?
Yeah, it's on here.
Condor?
Let me show it to you.
Okay, that's amazing.
But basically, I just wanted
Operation
to get...
Condor was a transnational effort to it was part of the Guerra Sucia, wasn't it? To kill leftists, and surely he couldn't have meant that.
Well, he was talking about the
poppy
extraordinary cultivations.
Oh, okay, yes. Oh,
That's
he's
what
talking
he was
about the
talking
1980s poppy eradication in. I didn't realize that was Operation Condor though. Because there's a different condor in a South American context. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Melissa. Go ahead.
No.
Can I see it?
I do want to show it to you. Yeah,
Okay.
I can't find where it is right now.
Fascinating. Thank you, listeners, for sitting through it with us. Do you mind if I look at the text, though?
Yes,
just real quick?
please do.
Yeah. Because he had some interesting things to say. Go ahead. Finish your question.
Okay, so I'll read something that I thought was interesting. But he basically said that instead of ruining our relationship with them, we should be focusing on new ways that we can help Mexico with our efforts. And that U.S. political leaders can and should be exploring how to improve bilateral cooperation with Mexico, as well as multilateral efforts, including with China.
Okay, so China. So I found here. Thank you for letting me Google it. My confusion was that there's two Operation Condors. I was familiar with this very nefarious Operation Condor that apparently, thank you to the internet for being the source of all knowledge. There was a 1970s era effort to murder left-wingers, basically among the military governments in Uruguay and Argentina and the Chileans and the Brazilians. They would all cooperate with it and throw people from helicopters.
Very different.
Hence my confusion.
Yeah.
Apparently there was another Operation Condor in the 1970s that was, I guess that's the only South American bird they can think of, right? And so it's... the Nixon administration's cooperation with the Mexicans to eradicate the poppy crop.
I remember because this
Mexico.
is the first episode of Narcos.
It is. Yeah, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's first of Narcos Mexico, right, where they come in and like burn the fields and things like that. Okay, so this article, which you sent me, which is an amazing piece. It's from Crisis Group, which is actually a very good organization. Falco Ernst, one of the best
He's awesome.
analysts out there, who we've met in Mexico City, works with Crisis Group. And I always appreciate individuals in the policy space who have strong opinions and don't mind interacting and engaging with people with strong opinions different from theirs. And so Falco to me is a real model of intellectual rigor and honesty, and I like that, even though we each think the other is wrong on a few key points. But this is by I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name, Brian Finucane. This piece, it's called Dangerous Words, The Risky Rhetoric of the U.S. War on Mexican Cartels. And it was good. You know, when you sent it to me, I was glad you sent it to me because I actually agreed with a lot of its analysis. I did not agree with the conclusion, but it talked about what it would mean if we were to do things like, for example, declare Mexican cartels, excuse me, to be a foreign terror organization. Could I read a passage? Do you mind from it?
Please do. Absolutely.
So he writes about things like this. Although by no stretch would an FTO, foreign terror organization, designation authorize the use of military force, it could be read as a signal that military engagement is in the offing. And he's right about that, actually, which is one of the reasons that we support it. I think we've said very clearly before here on this podcast that our first choice is not to militarize the war on the cartels. It's militarized in Mexico already, but to engage the U.S. military in it. But we think it needs to be on the table, right? It needs to be something that there needs to be a signal and an understanding that ultimately the United States will stop at nothing to protect American citizens and communities. And so I agree with him on that. He's got a lot of really good text. Where I think he sort of exemplifies, and by the way, I don't know this author at all, so this is not a personal attack at all, because again, I think he's got a lot of really solid analysis in here. So Brian Finucane, if you're watching, I do this in a spirit of collegiality, but his close basically says the Mexican state will surely need to continue using force for some time in order to bring the wanton criminality in its territory to heel, and it needs to do so as part of a calibrated strategy. And so then he goes through listing like what the elements of that strategy would be. Proving those susceptible to joining criminal ranks with alternative pathways requires concerted efforts by Mexico and international partners. Mexico could use U.S. support for many of these efforts. So let's talk about that, because this is exactly the same thing that you and I heard from U.S. government personnel in Mexico City. The Mexicans, we just got to have a partnership and concerted efforts and, continue to aid them in that. The argument that we've been making, and events unfortunately have borne us out over the past year really on this, is that partnership is effectively over, because you ultimately cannot have, if you don't have a Mexican state that is interested in exercising full sovereignty over Mexico, if you don't have a Mexican state that is interested in quashing challenges to its authority, if you don't have a Mexican state that is interested in real partnership with the United States or anyone else, then how can you predicate policy based on any of those things? The United States, and I think this is Crisis Group's preference, is to go, and again, Crisis Group, great organization, so not no disparagement of them, but this is their preference, is to continue on as if all those things are true. The argument that we're making, the argument that the coalition makes, whose statement we released, 4 days back at the time of this recording, is that partnership doesn't meaningfully exist. That desire on the part of the Mexican state doesn't meaningfully exist. And it's because that Mexican state is a partner with the cartels. Yeah. And realizing that gets us to actually most of this analysis, but with a completely different conclusion. And that's the difference that I think the foundation and our partners, Heritage, AFPI, and elsewhere are bringing to the table. Yeah,
no, I agree. It's a great sentiment. I wish we could all work together, but they don't want our help.
It would be honestly, it would be a better world if we were wrong and they were right. But we have to face things as they are.
I will say though, I think that the Mexican government is very well aware of the threat, that there's been a lot of talk about U.S. intervention. Because obviously, I think when this was brought up many years ago under Trump, people were shocked about the U.S. ever having this conversation of using military force against Mexico. But it's gained a lot of traction in the last couple of years, to the point where AMLO himself has been talking a lot about it. And we were just discussing that what happened in Tlajemulco. last week with the roadside
yeah.
bombs that killed those police officers
yes, the
and
IED
those
clusters.
civilians. Yeah. We were just talking about that. Someone asked him in a press conference, someone asked AMLO. In fact, the Jalisco governor, Enrique Alfaro, called it a terrorist attack. He said it was a terrorist act to do that. And then someone asked AMLO, do you agree? Like, do you think that this is terrorism? And he was very quick to say no for a couple of reasons. Because it didn't fit the definition of terrorism. And then the last thing he said in that moment was like, we don't need to be giving the Americans more reason to think that they can come here and interfere.
Oh, yeah.
The actual quote, let's not open the door for our neighboring ultra-conservatives who want to have excuses, pretexts for violating our sovereignty.
Yeah.
So
neighboring ultra-conservatives.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is getting close to a majority of Americans at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty significant sentiment. That's exactly right. I'm not sure. President Trump, the one big thing he did that got results to pressure the Mexican regime, the current Mexican regime, was the tariff threat that he brought to bear that resulted in the MPP Remain in Mexico program. And that threat that was there got results. It was, to me, a model of how to deal with the Mexican state in general, which is you have to be very clear and very firm in your position that this is how it's going to be. Although there was discussion, we found out post facto, mostly because Mark Esper wrote a memoir congratulating himself for this. There was discussion internal to the Trump White House that you should use the U.S. military to. I think the context was take out drug labs or something like that, which is not really a refined concept of operation, but at least it's there. Former SecDef Esper talked about it, bragged about the fact that he killed it, which, thanks Secretary of Defense, you killed a measure to defend Americans, which sort of shows you how disconnected kind of the D.C. crowd is from the actual needs of American communities right now. But it was never a public conversation. What's different now, at least on the right, is that there is a public conversation about it. And we've talked about this before. You've got, Dan Crenshaw, Mike Waltz, Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump, I believe, all talking about this idea that maybe the purpose of our national security establishment is actually to secure the nation. And part of that is securing the southern border. So I think it has obviously caught AMLO's attention. What I don't think has happened is it hasn't sunk in that it might get into the realm of the real. And I don't think AMLO believes it. I don't think kind of the Mexican regime in general believes it. Right now, I think it is a handy rhetorical talking point. So the question for policymakers is, this is one reason an FTO designation would be so useful, is what do you do to signal that these dreams or nightmares, in the case as maybe, could come true?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe part of the problem is there's not a lot of respect for the U.S. right now.
No.
There's not a lot of fear for the U.S. And part
Not
of that
in
might
Latin
be the leadership, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
But since we're on the topic of intervention,
Sure.
we never really got to cover this last week because we had so much to cover, but we kind of previewed it. And so I wanted to go into Ebrard.
Oh,
and how
Marcelo.
he made his trip to Florida to protest
Yes.
the racist laws and policies of the United States against migrants. And also just maybe start talking about the fact that he's running now, and we can ease into talking a little bit about the elections, which we've been wanting to do for a while.
We have been wanting to do exactly that. Well, I mean, Marcelo Ebrard, who is sort of this, I don't know how you describe him, this walking picture of the kind of the Polanquito, upper class.
Yep.
He's got his, I don't know where he has his degrees from, Harvard or Yale or something like that. But he's an upper class Mexican guy who went to the United States. I believe the United States for college and grad school, and then came back and became mayor of Mexico City after AMLO, and then foreign minister, and now he's running for president.
Yeah.
And so Ebrard is trying to reinvent himself as like a man of the people, which is weirdly comic. Every time you see, and you know exactly the class of people I'm talking about.
Yes. The elite.
The elites. I'll never forget having a breakfast in Polanco with one of these folks, and he asked me just kind of offhand, what have you seen in Mexico City? And I said, well, I actually have not seen. At that point, I hadn't seen as much as I wanted to, but I've only seen kind of like the nice areas. I've seen Condesa and Polanco and some of Roma Norte, and he said the rest is trash. don't see it. And I thought, well, that's quite a sentiment for your country and the people whom you presumably aspire to be among the elites for. But but it's not uncommon among like this class of wealthier sort of elite Mexicans. And Ebrard is manifestly one of those individuals. I don't know that he actually thinks Mexico is trash. I don't want to impute that to him. But he wants to be president now. I think it's his turn. His major competitor is Claudia Sheinbaum, current mayor of Mexico City, who's also this credentialed elite. She's a scientist of some sort.
Yeah.
I believe. I forget what she's a scientist in.
Me too.
Chemistry or botany or something like that. Anyway, a very smart woman, on her own terms. But at the same time, what's been interesting is that as she has campaigned for the presidency, she has gone to like these comic lengths of adopting AMLO's speech patterns and mannerisms, right? And so you probably
she's trying to be his clone.
She's trying to be his clone.
No longer a puppet, now a clone.
I mean, she's a lady named Claudia Sheinbaum who is from Mexico City. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but now AMLO's a peasant. I mean, he has the mannerisms of a peasant, I should say. I don't say that as disparagement. It's just a reality. He's an earthy guy. He's an earthy left populist. And Claudia's not. So it's very interesting to see these videos of her where she's suddenly just like getting down with the people. And it almost has this Kamala Harris vibe to it of let me vibe with you.
But you have to see it to believe it. Because you told me about it before I saw the video myself. And when I saw it, I couldn't believe it. Like the hand gestures, the costeño accent.
That right?
I'm going to link it because I think everybody needs to watch it.
Please do.
To know what we're talking about.
It's so different. Yeah, no, it's definitely not her. And then she did the video where she goes to one of the border markers. So on the U.S.-Mexico border, there's these markers, and they actually the markers actually say typically that this is the border as established by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And she goes to the border marker, and she kind of looks very sad, and she points out, and she says, I'm just here to remember the time that my country was ripped in half by the invaders from the north, and we have to stop it from happening again. And it's just, wow. I mean, it's very different. It's just sort of this descent into, so these are two of the three major Morena candidates.
Yeah.
Both, neither of whom is a person of the people.
No.
You've got the third, Adán Augusto López, who's Secretario de Gobernación. I think he's still in office, so he's not formally a candidate yet.
Not yet, no.
Yeah, but he's the one who, on the Guacamaya leaks, was revealed to be in league with many of the cartels. Yeah. So he's a person. What's interesting to me is the opposition. Have you followed this with the opposition? So why don't you talk about this?
Well, the funniest part to me is she's indigenous. She's a senator.
Xochitl Galvez.
Xochitl Galvan.
Xochitl Galvan.
Galvez.
Oh, it's Galvez. Okay,
sorry.
Okay. That's all right.
But she's running. She's of more modest origins. I've seen these videos where she's talking about how when she was little, when she was growing up, she used to sell candy on the street to support her family. And it's just very interesting because, like you said, the people that are right now on AMLO's side are what a lot of us would consider the elite, even though they try to pretend they're not. I mean, they say people of our origin. Well, that's questionable.
Right.
And here we have like a real indigenous person, and I think that a lot of people on AMLO's side will be threatened because she might actually be able to relate to the people of Mexico.
Yes.
So it'll be interesting to see what would happen, and it seems like AMLO is a little bit threatened. He's saying that he's not. He basically came out and said that she was a really bad move for his opposition, and because that didn't go well, because that balloon did not float, now he's seeing the opposition focus on the violence that's going on in Mexico. Because we talked about this last week, but AMLO's time in office is shaping up to be the most violent time in any president's history, in modern history.
Yes.
And so now he's saying that they're focusing on violence, but it's funny because he acts like he's not threatened at all, but he also called in for an investigation into her company. She responded to that and just said, like, machos like you can't handle like an intelligent woman. And so there's been all this back and forth, but I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens, because if it's Xochitl and Claudia, we could have like a woman's battle here. And I mean, especially in a country that has long been kind of known for like the machismo a little bit in politics, that could be very unprecedented.
It could be interesting, although if it was Claudia, I would have to question whether machismo is over if it's a woman who wins by basically transforming herself into a clone of the man who preceded her.
Yeah.
Right. But I agree with you. It's clear that AMLO is kind of freaked out by Galvez's candidacy, that the conservatives, whereas it looks like the Morenistas are going to put up people named Ebrard and Sheinbaum, and then the conservatives have a working class woman who is entirely indigenous or mostly indigenous. Anyway, is entirely indigenous, and that's their candidate. And she's actually a pretty good retail politicker. In full candor, I still think Morena is going to win just because they control everything at this point. But man, I hope it's a real election. I hope it's a real contest for Mexico's sake.
And we'll follow it closely. One thing I found very fascinating when I was researching her is she is now running with a conservative party. But it appears that she's socially very liberal. Have you looked into this?
She's a panista, right? She's
she defends like LGBTQ. She defends abortion, and I've just been thinking,
that's interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, she even has defended the president's like social welfare programs, which is very interesting. But I was thinking about this a lot on the flight on the way here.
Mm-hmm.
How that ideology, like these ideologies that we're seeing in Mexico, are so different than anything that we would see here. And I think we talked about this in an episode, how AMLO is very much a leftist, and he's a socialist. We've talked about this.
Yes.
But he is socially not progressive at all. He's very conservative.
Pro-life.
Yes, he's denounced like the trans movement. He thinks women should be in the household, like all of these things.
Has he said that? I didn't know that.
So he said that feminism is the biggest threat to institutions.
Did he really?
Which the institution that is the most important in Mexico is the family. Okay. So he thinks that women being feminists and not having babies is the biggest threat. So he said things like that, which obviously I don't think that feminists would love. But it's interesting because we have this leftist, this socialist that's very, very socially conservative. Mm-hmm. Devout Catholic, all of it. And now we have this person running for the conservative movement who's socially very liberal. So I was just thinking that's so different than anything we have ever seen here in the U.S.
It's a very different mix, and I think one of the things it highlights is the extent to which politics. This isn't just Mexico, but this is across Latin America, as you know well, are personalized. I mean, they're personal vehicles, and so it's about the person. It was Jorge Castañeda, I think, who made the point. It could be somebody else. I think it was him who made the point that you just have to look at the names of political movements in the English-speaking world versus the Mexican world, was specifically what he was saying. So in the English-speaking world, it's all about ideas. It's conservatives, it's liberals, it's progressives, and so on. And in Mexico, it's all about the man: zapatistas, carrancistas, villistas, and so on. And so AMListas, you see those as well, and this to me goes right in it. There isn't quite the same basket of ideological litmus tests that you would find, and so you can get the conservative candidate, who I suppose will be the conservative opposition in the general election coming up, who is everything you said. I didn't know that she was, but it's not surprising, I guess. Pro-abortion, pro-LGBT, and so on. And then meanwhile, you have AMLO, who is a leftist autocrat. I mean, we should be clear about that. Mm-hmm. But you're right. The feminists hate him. Hate him. I remember being in Mexico City after one of their big marches and rallies, and the whole kind of the approaches to the Zócalo along Parque Alameda were just scrawled with like feminist graffiti and things like that. And so it's a different basket of goods than you'd have in the United States.
We'll have to follow it closely and see what happens. But
we will.
I think that being said, we're almost out of time. Is there any last closing thoughts?
No, but welcome back. It's good to have you back, and thank you. Thanks as always for doing an episode.
All right, and thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time.